What's going on, everyone? So you guys remember this build just a couple of videos ago. This is actually Lisa's custom yellow and black themed build, but there's a problem, and many of you pointed this out. You were not too pleased with the yellow coating on this graphics card. Now, I don't regret painting this part yellow. What I do regret, though, is not painting the rest of this black. And once a few of you started saying that, I started to realize more and more that, you know what, they're all right. It would look so much better if this kind of silver metallic shroud here was painted black to match the rest of the build, which is predominantly black and yellow. Now, my initial thinking was like, okay, well, there's a tiny sliver of silver in the CableMod Pro cables up here, and maybe that could, set things off, but it doesn't really do that for me, and I completely understand why so many of you were upset with the graphics card in particular. So what we're gonna do is, actually, we're gonna use two different types of paint here. You're wondering what that metallic paint is for. Bear with me. First off, though, we're going to use this Rust-Oleum. This is like auto enamel. It's a little different than what we used before, but this is metal, and it is supposed to work well with metal components. So we're going to paint using this for the outside perimeter of the card. So all the silver metal you see here will be painted a gloss black, which should look similar to the yellow gloss that we have around that particular section of the card. But then I want to do something just a little different, and I'm going to run tests before and after to confirm this, but we're going to use this Rust-Oleum metallic paint here to paint the heatsink inside behind this little plastic panel here silver or metallic. So I think that if we invert the colors and we make the inside silver and the rest of the card black, then it'll fit almost perfectly with our cable color scheme up top. So yeah, to be honest, I really don't know how this is going to look. I think it'll look better than it already does, but if we are just not pleased with the end result, then I could always just use nail polish remover and just scrub all this paint off and start from scratch. But I really think that inverting the colors will do this card justice, because there's too much silver in it now. I totally agree, because the rest of the build does not have any black in it, so I think inverting the colors is going to look really good. I'm going to show you guys step by step how to tear down the Founders Edition card, and then talk about how I paint a little more in detail than I did in the last video involving this build. So let's get started. The Sennheiser PC37X is a new take on gaming headsets, prioritizing both a sleek design and optimal comfort. That's a tricky combo there. Audio is top notch as always, that's no surprise, but the microphone here is a thing of beauty. You're actually listening to it right now. Not bad for a plug and play headset. Click the link in the video description for more details. Alright, so what you'll find with these Founders Edition cards, they are very well built, they're very heavy, they're also a pain to disassemble completely. Now, it's easy to isolate the board from the rest of the cooler, but to take apart the cooler to the extent that we need to be able to paint the little heatsink in here, also this silver shroud, is going to require a full teardown, and there are probably 30 or 40 screws to consider when doing such a thing. I had to do that when I first painted this part of the shroud here, so it's going to be time consuming, but I'll show you guys step by step everything you need to take care of. So the first thing we'll need to remove is the back plate, and you can see we have tiny screws, Phillips screws, all across both back plates. I actually lost a screw here, not that it matters because the card is vertically mounted, and then this screw broke off. So these are actually kind of a pain depending on how well they're torqued into the cooler. Just be very careful with this. Make sure that you have an appropriately sized Phillips head screwdriver. These are very small, a lot smaller than these four here, holding the board in place. So I recommend having something like iFixit kits will be pretty good for this. I have just a smaller Cobalt set, and I use the smallest Phillips head available. That's this one here. Grips pretty well. Don't strip these screws. If you do, you're gonna have a terrible time trying to take this thing apart. And you'll see the back plate comes in two sections. So once the first section is removed here toward the right side of the card, just go ahead and set this to the side. Now you're probably wondering why this is a green PCB and not the darker typical Founders reference card PCB, and that is because I actually did something during this next step when I was originally dissecting the card that killed the board. So it wouldn't post, the card would not show up red as anything, and it wouldn't even receive power. And I think it had to do with something I pulled off the board accidentally when I was unscrewing these little hexagonal, I don't know what you want to call them, but they're screws on one end. So you have to have a tool that either grips completely around each of these hex heads, or you have to use some sort of like gripping tool and just untwist it that way. That's what I did because I don't have a hex tool that untwists this small. Actually I do, but it's in the garage and I'm a little lazy. So I just used some needle nose pliers to twist these out. But these actually hold the PCB to the cooler, not just these 4 Phillips screws here. So you want to remove all of these. This is probably the most intense part of the disassembly here, only because the tool required is not, it's not a common household tool. And if you do use something like pliers, you want to be very careful not to nick any of these smaller resistors and transistors all across the PCB. That's what I did. That's why the other board died, and that's why we're stuck with an ugly green one now. So once you remove the smaller screws, you have these last 4 Phillips screws here with these little springs underneath to remove. Be careful because the GPU is right between them. Also, we do have 2 Phillips screws here on the rear I/O plate to remove, this one here as well as this one, and then the board should completely detach from the cooler. And now with all screws removed, very carefully remove the PCB from the cooler. Try not to bend the board because you could dislodge things, including the GPU from the board. So we're gonna try to, there we go. Now there is one connection here between the cooler and the board, and that is for the fans. Actually, depending on the model, you might have more than one connection, maybe for LEDs. I disconnected that because this card, again, is sitting vertically. I didn't want ugly green letters here, so I just went ahead and took it out completely. And then this one other connection for the fan we'll have to worry about. There we go. And now the board is entirely separated from the cooler. So for this next one, you're going to need a 564 hex and a 332 hex. The larger one will be for the 4 hex screws surrounding the shroud that we just painted. And then the smaller hex screw will be for these 4, as well as these screws on the side, both on the top and bottom. Alright, so here is every piece of a Founders Edition GTX 1070, save the PCB and the backplate and of course the screws. This is everything, and you can see it's quite a bit here. Most companies, third-party manufacturers at least, will use just a few parts. You'll have one solid backplate, usually one solid front plate, if you will, and then 2 fans. Well, you can see there's a lot more going on here. So this is the piece we're going to paint, the largest piece. We're also going to paint the back side of this. This will also be black. I think I'm going to leave these silver. It'll be nice little trim pieces. They go on the sides, and just want to have a little bit of silver still in there. And then this is the basically heat sink. This is a big block here, and we're going to clean this up. Make sure that you clean your components before you paint them, and then we will try our best to paint this a smooth metallic color. The first thing you should do is clean the surface you're trying to paint. This should be a pretty obvious point here. No hair, no dust, any of that gets trapped under the paint will look terrible in post. The other thing is to make sure that your environment is sealed. I use a box and I try to paint indoors if possible. Do it next to a window so that there aren't any unwanted fumes stuck in the room after the fact. If you have a fan, you can turn that on. Don't turn it on high though, because you might blow dust around while the paint is trying to dry. Make sure to shake the spray can vigorously before you start spraying. Have a few test sprays first off to the side, not actually on the object, so you can get used to how intense the spray is going to be before you actually start applying the paint. I recommend beginning to spray while pointing away from the object, and then while spraying, swoop over the object and then stop spraying once you're pointing away from the object on the other side of it. This will prevent overspray, especially when you begin spraying in the beginning. You might have unwanted splotches show up if you start spraying immediately onto the object. I recommend between 4 and 5 coats for a process like this. The application, of course, will depend on the object and how heavy each coat is, though in general I found that around 4 or 5 coats is plenty. The more the merrier, as long as it doesn't look like it's just been dipped in a jar of paint. And lastly, make sure that these objects are properly dried before you begin touching them with your hands. If the paint is not completely dry, you will move the paint around, you will have fingerprints on the object, and that will look terrible in post. So please, please, please be patient. Even if you are unsure of whether or not the paint is dry or not, wait a few more hours. That's right, I said hours, because some paint will take quite a while to dry, and depending on the environment, if it's very humid outside, very hot, that paint may take even longer to dry. All right, so it is like 2 in the morning. I'm not going to talk very loud, but you can see kind of just a test fit here, what everything looks like so far. I think I'm going to put one more coat for the black shroud on both sides. It's kind of a metallic finish, and it actually almost blends in with the black that was already on the card. And then we have, of course, a little plastic piece here that goes between the shroud and the silver heatsink. I didn't realize before that the metallic paint isn't actually engine enamel, but the black paint is. So the fact that I painted the heatsink, or the fins, whatever you want to call this, with a paint that's actually not thermally conductive, might impact our temperatures a bit more than I thought. So we'll have to see. Worst case, you learn from my mistakes. You get the metallic paint that is engine enamel. It usually has little ceramic bits in it, and those ceramic bits conduct the heat and allow it to transfer nearly seamlessly through the paint itself from the metal underneath to the air. So it's just something that I didn't realize until now. Probably should have looked at that beforehand, but I'm not too concerned. I don't think this paint's gonna, absolutely toast the heatsink. I just think it would have been a better choice to go with engine enamel, like the black paint, for the metallic stuff. So for now, we're gonna let this dry. Again, I'm gonna apply one more coat of paint before I sleep, and then tomorrow morning we'll kick things off and hopefully have a finished product. Alright, and I think I am happy with this. This is day 2. Painting usually requires 2 days. I recommend you let the paint sit for approximately 24 hours, even though it says that it'll be good within usually an hour or so. Just because, when you touch the paint, when it's not totally dry, you can get fingerprints. You can actually remove paint just by kind of smudging it. And that is the result of it not being totally set into whatever you're trying to paint. But this paint here is specifically for metal components, and that's why it bonded so well. I believe the same thing over here is the case. But nonetheless, we're going to go ahead and reinstall these pieces now with the black shroud that we just painted, as well as the silver heatsink underneath. We're going to check thermals on this bad boy, see how bad we messed it up, because I did not buy the enamel for the metallic paint. I didn't realize that. I should have, but I think it'll be okay. I think the thermal properties aren't going to be hindered too much, and I think now that we have the yellow on black, things are going to look just a bit better. Also, one other thing you can do while you have your graphics card torn apart is replace the stock thermal compound, assuming it hasn't already been replaced. So the stuff they typically put on there is pretty crappy. It gets very crusty and it doesn't transfer heat very well. So applying a fresh amount of thermal compound is usually a good idea. I'm going to go ahead and do this on camera just to show you how much I put on here. And the idea is to put enough to spread across the entire die. So keep in mind, this is different than a CPU. So CPU, the metal part you see on top is the IHS. It's not the die itself. The die is underneath that, and it's typically smaller than this for most consumer grade CPUs. So you want to cover this entire little mirrored surface here, because all of this will generate heat. All right, and here is the finished product. I'd say this is about a 1 foot mod. It's pretty good considering I'm not, a professional painter by any means. But given the tools that I had, the resources that I had, and the little knowledge I have about, painting, I'd say this is pretty good. There are a couple places I need to touch up. Right here, a little bit of yellow paint is nicked from removing the screws a second time around to paint. The polish here on the black is not perfect. It's a little spotty. It looks a little more metallic and shiny than I wanted. But all in all, I think it looks pretty good. It looks better definitely than the silver before, and I think that the silver underneath is a nice touch as well to complement this little spindle here in the blower style fan. So now let's go ahead and install it and call it a day. And alright, so a couple things I want to say to end this video. The first is very, very important. I have this linked at the top of the video description, just in case. This will void your warranty, more than likely. I mean, it's basically a done deal. Once you remove the screws with the little paint tips in them, then the manufacturers can tell that you disassembled the card after its manufactured date. That will likely void your warranty. And that just shows that you tampered with the card, and they'll just pin any of the issues that you could potentially have with the card after the fact on the fact that you disassembled it. So just keep that in mind. This is more of an enthusiast thing. Obviously, if you just have one graphics card and it's your absolute sweetheart, don't disassemble it. Second, make sure to label and group all of your screws accordingly. There are like 40 or 50 with this particular card. Usually it's a bit less than that for third-party manufacturers, but you want to keep these separate and organized, because you don't want to, try to screw a particular screw into the improper thread, right? You could just completely strip the threading, and then you can't properly mount the card back to itself, right? You can't mount the cooler to the PCB or the backplate to the PCB, whatever. So keep those organized, and again, remember that this will likely void your warranty. This is an enthusiast thing. I only recommend it for people who are willing to take that risk. That said, though, I'm really happy with the way this turned out, and I think Lisa is too, and ultimately her opinion is really the only one that I care about in the end. But I do want to know what you guys think, just for future reference, because you guys ultimately got me to change this, right? She didn't care about the silver as much, but you guys did, and enough of you said it to where I brought it up to her, and I was like, what if I painted the shroud black? And she said, you know what, that would probably look a little better. So you guys kind of gave her that idea, and that's what led to this video. So again, critique, I don't mind. At the end of the day, just don't be just bluntly rude, but give me constructive criticism. I'm totally open to that stuff, because I might implement your ideas into future revisions or future builds on this channel. Thanks for watching, you guys. Thumbs up if you liked it, dislike it if you feel the complete opposite. Click that red subscribe button if you haven't already, and stay tuned for more content like this. This is Science Studio. Thanks for painting with us.